David. David Weil. David Weil was recently sworn in, as recently as 3.5 weeks ago, as the How many months exactly, David, was that waiting for that? 9 months he waited to get sworn in. But he was recently sworn in as the administrator of the Wage and Hour Division. Just to put this in perspective, the last confirmation of a Wage and Hour Administrator before David happened in 2001. So I think that deserves another big round of applause. As many of you know, David is an internationally recognized expert in public and labor market policy, and that's why he's such an excellent choice to be the newest administrator. He's done work on regulatory performance, industrial and labor relations, transparency policy, and in particular, I was going to talk about some of this today, supply chain restructuring and its effects on the labor market. Now, prior to becoming administrator of Wage and Hour, Dr. Weil was professor of economics and the Everett W. Ward Distinguished Faculty Scholar at Boston University School of Management. He also served as co-director of the Transparency Policy Project at the Ash Institute at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's a prolific scholar. He's written 3 books on labor market policy. I have to say I cut my teeth on your Stitch in Time. I learned more about the textile industry from David than anybody other than probably John Tunlap. His most recent book is called The Fissured Workplace. He's authored numerous articles and publications in economics and public policy and industrial relations. And he's been a prolific contributor to non-academic outlets as well. So he's a geek who knows how to speak plain English. This will serve him well at the Department of Labor. Now, David, it's been a terrific appointment, I think, at the Department of Labor because he has a past working relationship with them. He worked as advisor to the Wage and Hour Division and to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He served as a mediator and an advisor in a range of labor union and labor management settings around the globe, so he has an international perspective. In addition to his work at the U.S. Department of Labor, his research work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, in terms of foundations, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, and the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. He's a graduate from Cornell University, and he has his master's and PhD in public policy at Harvard University. So join me in giving a warm welcome to David Weil. The plan is he's going to speak for 20-ish minutes or so, and then he will take some questions as well. So it gives you a chance to think of some questions. We have some microphones at both sides of the room, so when David finishes, if you have a question for him, if you wouldn't mind lining up at one of the 2 mics, that would be terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a treat to look out at a set of friendly faces, faces who I've known a long time. It's a very nice experience. I want to thank, first of all, Lisa for her kind introduction. And Lisa, along with a lot of people in the room, have been my guides through this last 9 months in purgatory, and have been really so wonderful in supporting me personally and institutionally. And there are a lot of people I could name in this room who played that role. I deeply appreciate that. And I will continue to lean on many of you for your ideas and insights as I face some of the challenges I'd like to talk about. And I just want to, again, acknowledge many folks in the room who are really, I'm so indebted to for lots and lots of reasons. I also will apologize for, I'm sure, my glazed and dazed look passing many of you. It's quite an immersion going from the life of a professor to the life of in Washington. And I often feel I'm kind of in this vortex. When I see familiar faces out there, it's like you want to grab out and say hello. But if I look a little dazed, I hope you'll understand. I feel like saying sometimes, I used to be Professor David Weil. I'm not quite sure who I am at the moment. I bring you greetings from Secretary Tom Perez, who I have the good fortune to work with and who I told I'd be speaking to you today. The Secretary I think he broke records. He did 4 graduate commencement speeches in the last 3 days. I think he did 4, something like that. So he's been in his own whirlwind, but he's certainly a great supporter of the academic and applied work that goes on among the network of people here at LIRA. So what I wanted to do for about 20 minutes is to just reflect a little bit about what, and these are in some senses first impressions about what we're trying to do at Wage and Hour in the context of some of the issues I've been very interested and concerned about for a long time in terms of the restructuring of the employment relationship in our economy, and I think I'm finding more and more in many industrialized and industrializing places across the globe. The idea that I call the fissured workplace, there's a lot of different ways. I know people in this room who are studying similar phenomenon, whether it's subcontracting, evolving supply chains, contingent workforce. I think we're all grappling with how these changes have really transformed employment relations and industrial relations. And I want to talk about that from the perspective of the challenges, the Wage and Hour division, which if you're less familiar with it, the Wall Street Journal in commenting, I'm trying to be judicious, commenting on my appointment, called the Wage and Hour Division the most secret and powerful agency in the federal government. Delighted to hear that. But clearly what they're referring to is the fact that we enforce some of the most fundamental workplace laws out there. We enforce child labor laws. We enforce the minimum wage and overtime. We enforce the Davis-Bacon Act and other prevailing wage acts. And we make sure that workers' rights are protected when they exercise their rights that are created by those fundamental acts. So it is a fundamental agency, and I want to talk about our challenges as an agency. I want to talk about, I'm ending my 4th week at the Labor Department. I spent today, actually this morning, with the district office here in Portland, meeting the men and women of the career staff here. I spent most of last week in Kansas City, where I had the chance to meet the entire regional and district office management staff, which is about 250 people of the agency, and get to know them and learn about the work they're doing. And I was talking to Harry Katz at lunch about Catherine Abraham, the former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who said, one of the things she was struck by was the talent in our career service, in the public service, and the dedication. And I have certainly been so impressed by that, and the folks I've met already. I think the public sector has been beaten up a lot in the last decade or more. And the people who actually hold these jobs and do the work are people who are really underappreciated and certainly central to the mission about what we do. So I want to talk about our mission and what we're up to. And I want to also put a sort of a subtext to this discussion, and that is the importance of the academy in understanding and assisting institutions in the public sphere through the work we do. through sometimes the critical, or it might be critical in the sense of thinking about how that work could be done better. But I think we as academics, particularly in an applied field like workplace, industrial relations, and labor market policy, in some sense owe it to really think hard about how our work can inform the work that our public institutions do. That's something I've always tried to do in the work that I've done, and I think a lot of people, including the person to my left, has done throughout their career. I think we can do more, and maybe I'm preaching particularly to you younger folks in the room about the opportunities, and I think the intellectual interest in that can engender. So let me talk a bit about the challenge, and I won't go into it. There's a lot of sessions and panels that are talking about the changing workplace on the schedule, and I'm looking forward to participating in a couple of those. But I could summarize the challenge with a few numbers. The Wage and Hour Division oversees 7.5 million establishments. And our laws cover 135 million working people in the United States. And while for a guy who's been a professor and managing, let us say, smaller groups, there are 1,100 investigators currently, and we are authorized to add significantly to that in the next year. I'm pleased to say. But we have 1,100 investigators and another 600 technicians, support, policy people in our organization. But when you think about that 1,100 relative to 7.5 million workplaces, those odds mean we can never be in enough places to enforce the law on our own. It's simply impossible, and you could double our allocation, and it would still be essentially the same small statistic. In addition, our charge is particularly about helping vulnerable workers, and the vulnerable workers, low-wage workers in our economy, are often people who, while they are given rights under the law, more often than not don't exercise their rights because of fears of recrimination or retribution as a result of the use of those rights. So we're serving a workforce that, while the law is structured to allow them to signal problems by complaining, sometimes the people who are most in need of help are the least likely to complain. So we have that to contend with. We are coming out of a period of 25 years, as is no surprise to anyone in this room, of eroding standards. The standards of what is acceptable in the workplace, in my estimation, have declined tremendously. Not only in terms of non-compliance with laws, but just the standards of what working people should expect as reasonable behavior in the workplace. And the problem with eroding standards and the decline of norms is that tends to continue to lower down if you don't push in the opposite direction. And then finally, it's not challenge enough, we have the fissured workplace. We have in more and more situations, the laws that we have are contending with the workplace where the employment relationship itself is busting apart in lots and lots of different ways. And so responsibilities, liability, who is in charge of the workforce, who is setting the standards of the workforce, and who ultimately is responsible for compliance with those laws is becoming murkier and murkier. And you put those things together, and you very quickly see the kind of challenge that an agency like the Wage and Hour Division is facing. So that's the complexity, that's the challenge. What is not challenging is something that again, I think draws the people who work in Wage and Hour, and I think the communities who care about these issues to it. What we're trying to do is so simple. It is the phrase that the President uses, the Secretary uses, and that I have taken to using to describe what we do. It's very simple. We're making sure that working people in the U.S. receive a fair day's pay for a hard day's work. I mean, that's really everything we do is about that. So the mission is clear. The importance of that to the maintenance of standards, in my mind, is fundamental, that doing that sets norms that ripple across a lot of other behaviors, both with respect to compliance with other workplace laws, and again, in terms of just the way we deal with each other and working people in American workplaces. And so achieving that mission, or stating the mission, is very clear. Doing it is much more complicated. One of the things that Wage and Hour has really focused intensively on over the last 5 years, I want to talk a bit about this evolution, is taking the range of tools that we have available and understanding, going back to the basic statistics I gave you, that we can never do this by running around trying to do an inspection here and an inspection there and trying to change the world that way. We have a range of tools available to us, and the real, I think, interesting, important work that's been done, and the work that I want to, during my tenure, take up a notch, is using those tools in an interactive way, in more effective ways. And those tools are outreach, just speaking to the world, in particular to employers, businesses, workers, worker advocates, and the public about what we're trying to do and what the responsibilities of employers are and what the rights of working people are. Education, particularly about the laws we are charged with making sure are put in place. Enforcement, obviously, and I'll talk about that. Regulation, you no doubt know that along with our regular charge of enforcing existing laws and regulation, the President has, in his agenda, has made his agenda central to the work we do. So we are looking at modernization of our overtime laws. We are, in January of 2015, our home care regulation that expands minimum wage and overtime coverage to home care workers will go into effect. We are working on the President's executive order in making sure that contractors to the government have to pay at least $10.10 to workers there. We're doing all that through regulation, and that's clearly a critical part of what we do. Litigation and our close work with the solicitor's office is crucial. And finally, transparency, providing the world information about the results of what we're doing. All of those are ultimately how I think we can work with the basically limited resources we always are going to have and ultimately try to help push forward on our mission. Historically, what Wage and Hour did was follow essentially a complaint-driven model. We responded to complaints where workers would lodge them, and we would go out and investigate and work hard to make sure workers who had lodged those complaints received the back wages they were entitled. And that inevitably sort of had a number of implications. Number one, it meant we went to where we heard the problems were. And as I've already alluded, that often isn't where the major problems, if you're looking at the economy as a whole, maybe reside. Someone who complains in the environment that I've described is probably someone who feels secure enough to do so. That might not be where the most vulnerable workers can be found. But that kind of complaint-driven approach tends to push you in that direction. It tends to push you in a reactive kind of mode. You're always going after where the signals are coming from. It pushes you towards a workplace focus. You take care of the problem at the workplace where you've been called. You don't necessarily think about the enterprise that complaint arose from, or the industry, or the set of network relationships and the businesses that surround it. It's very driven by back wages, which is a good thing. I mean, of course, we want to make sure that workers get the wages they are entitled. But if you just focus on back wages, you sometimes miss the behavior that is behind the fact that we're seeing back wages in the workplace. And it tends to put you on less of a focus on deterrence. You think less about how will this investigation dealing with this problem ripple out on other employers in the related industry or the related geographic area or in the related supply chain structure, you name it. And historically, the wage and hour division did emphasize its use of tools like civil monetary penalties, liquidated damages, the use of settlement agreements, or the use of publicity. And we've certainly had eras, I'm painting with a broad brush, we have had eras including how I came to know the organization in the Clinton era, where a lot of innovations were undertaken. But if you look at the wider span of the agency, and particularly in the years under the Bush administration, this kind of complaint focus is where our efforts were. That's changed dramatically since 2009 in really exciting ways. This might be maybe a little bit wonky ways, but exciting ways that I think it's important for people to understand. Moving away from that model isn't easy, but it is fundamental. Wage and hour in the beginning of the Obama administration really decided to change the way it thought about its whole set of policies. In general, it's captured in the agency under the general title of strategic enforcement, is to think about enforcement as a way of improving compliance, not getting back wages. That enforcement and the other tools of outreach, education, litigation, regulation, and transparency are ways of moving behavior so that when we go into workplaces, we don't find the problems to begin with. Yes, we take care of back wages. Yes, we continue to respond to complaints. But what we're really about is changing the nature of compliance and the incentives for compliance-based employers and improving conditions for working people. So we've done that, and let me just give you a sense of how that's changed. Certainly, we've grown the agency. Early in the first term, the president was able to hire an additional 300 investigators. That brought us up to about 1,100 that we stand at now. We've had retirements. We've had a lot of people who have left the agency, so we've actually brought in a whole new generation of wage and hour investigators. One of the most exciting things I saw in Kansas City was both the fact that we have a very young investigative force and a very diverse one, an investigator base that looks a lot like the workplaces we investigate, which is a very important, significant transformation. But it's not just numbers, and we've increased, therefore, the number of investigations we undertake. But what we really changed are things like our focus on priority industries. We have shifted away from responding to complaints and towards something that is called directed investigations, towards investigations where we're initiating what we're doing, informed by data, information, studies about where vulnerable workers are and how we go to them. If you look at the 2000s, before 2009, something like 75 to 80% of our investigations were complaint-based, and only 20-25% were directed. Today, 44% of our investigations are directed investigations, and that's moving up to 50%. And not only are we investigating more on this kind of proactive basis and in the industries where vulnerable workers are, like restaurants, hotels, janitorial, construction, retail segments of manufacturing, but we're also being more and more successful at finding those workplaces where we really find problems. So the quality of the investigation we carry out has improved. We have moved towards there's a verb in wage and hour now called mapping, that every investigation on the directed site starts with what is known as mapping the industry or mapping the business relationships, that we go in with a theory about what's going on and why do we see non-compliance. So if we look at an industry like agriculture, we are focused more and more on the supply chain and putting pressure on parts of the supply chain where we can have an effect on behavior. Very often, violations might be at the grower level, but if you just focus on the grower level, you don't change the dynamics in that industry that ultimately lead growers to have very thin margins and often violate the laws. You have to think about the entire supply chain. The approach, including some really fascinating presentations I heard about this morning, is based on this idea of let's understand how this industry works while the businesses within it are responding to it, and then thinking about how do we undertake, whether it's enforcement or outreach and education to the key parties to change on that activity. We're changing the tools we're using. Very rarely did wage and hour in the period from 2001 to 2008 ever use the civil monetary penalties that it is afforded the right to use. We have changed that dramatically, where we're finding violations of the law that are clearly not motivated just by an employer not understanding his or her responsibilities, but where it's an intentional set of behaviors to undermine the law or to flout the law. We're using both civil monetary penalties and an even stronger tool, liquidated damages, to make sure people understand there are consequences to that activity. That's important not just for the working people who are affected by it, but more fundamentally, it protects responsible employers who are, in many of the industries I named, are doing the right thing, and they're being undermined by employers who are not following the law and therefore at a competitive advantage. And if you look at an industry like residential construction or janitorial, that's huge. And if you don't make sure that the responsible employers have the level playing field for them to continue to operate in that manner, you're chasing your tail, and you're never going to change ultimately the behavior in that industry. We're using the tools we have in enforcement in an aggressive way to make sure that happens. We're doing active outreach to stakeholders in this period of time. We are reaching out to worker advocates. We're reaching out actively to working people so they know their rights. And we're reaching out to employer associations and employers. Again, to both understand responsibilities and also understand what we're out there trying to do. We have done almost 11,000 outreach events in the period of time since the Obama administration started, and those were geared towards advocacy groups about something like almost 36%, I have my statistics here, were outreach to advocacy groups and working groups. About 29% went to employers, and we have other groups, human resource groups, intermediaries that we reach out to as well. We've created new ways of interacting with the stakeholders that Wage and Hour is trying to deal with, and we have new parts of our organization, new non-investigator slots, a slot called CORE, which sole responsibility is to figure out ways to reach out more effectively to the groups we're trying to affect. And we're changing the way we're talking about our work. There's a wonderful paper that just came out by a fellow named Matt Johnson, who just coincidentally is a Boston University economics student. But he shows that publicity about enforcement actions has deterrent effects in OSHA. We're trying to use that same logic in Wage and Hour and look at how letting people know what we're doing in one part of an industry or a supply chain or an area can affect other people, affect other employers, and use that as a very powerful tool, hopefully, of creating the right incentives for people to do the right thing. And we're using different tools of social media. We're doing app contests to kind of integrate this information in ways people can use when they're picking a restaurant or a hotel or shopping, that I'm very excited about. So that's really what's been going on in the last 5 years. And that to me is only the beginning. And what I view my charge in my position is to take that to the next level. And what I've found is enormous enthusiasm from the agency about doing that. And again, I'll try not to wonk out here, but there's a lot we're trying to do to to institutionalize this and to make this go the next step. Let me just tell you a couple of things. First of all, when I go back to the phase of fair days paid for a hard day's work, the regulatory agenda we're undertaking is all about increasing or raising what the definition of a fair day's pay is in this economy. That's clearly the argument that you have all heard the president make about the importance of passing the minimum wage is about, but in a regulatory domain, we are actually acting on that by the executive order, which will raise the minimum wage for federal contractors to $10.10, that I think is a huge step forward in affecting the larger community by the part that federal contracting affords us an opportunity to do. The home care rule covering a whole group of people who were, I think, for a long time neglected by the absence of coverage under the FLSA, and changing our overtime regulation and bringing it to look more like the modern workplace, all will, I think, advance that mission, and it's clearly something that I and the agency is deeply involved in at this time. We're going to be refining our strategy. Business models, as anyone who studies businesses knows, business models evolve very quickly, and they often evolve as pressures around them change, including government enforcement pressures, they evolve. We're thinking a lot about how do we keep evolving our strategies as business models change. One of the things I enjoyed writing about the fissured workplace is every time I would go and give a talk and I would give examples, people would come up to me afterwards and say, hey, but have you heard about this model? Have you heard about this way that the employment relationship has been cut up further in licensing, different forms of franchising? We got to keep up with that and be agile in terms of how we develop our own strategies and policies in reaction to that, and doing things like this idea of mapping in an even more information-rich and sophisticated way. That certainly is one of the links back to this idea that people in this room, I think, can help agencies like ours think much more deeply about what's happening in the world and its consequences to working people and how we might think about that in terms of the work we're doing. We're trying to make the phrase I've been using is one wage an hour, and really making sure that the ground game that's played by district offices in places like Portland are linked to these kind of national strategies we're doing in Washington. I've already seen how one can sink into the Washington bubble and lose track of what's going on in the field. We're working very hard to think of ways to really make us one agency so we can bring creativity up and down the agency and respond more quickly. We're doing a lot. Again, I urge you all to give me your thoughts about this, to use social media and information, scouring the web, and linking information databases so we understand the state of the world better in a more sophisticated way. So systems like that. I've already alluded to it, but one of the most exciting things to me is we are growing our agency, and we're bringing a whole new generation of people who have no preconceived notions about how you do investigations into the fold, and they're growing up in a world of strategic enforcement. The number of people in my meetings last week who are our first level managers who came up to me and said, I've been here for 4 years or 5 years, and that's it, was really surprising to me. And that's a huge opportunity, and as I said, our authorization has us growing further. If any of you have bright, wonderful students who want to do good things, send them our way, because we're hiring and we're looking for creative people to take these jobs. I'm very serious about that. I think we've forgotten about the importance of government service as an important place for our best students to go. We're an agency, and there are other agencies in the Department of Labor that really need people with creative minds and mission-driven personalities to come and really form the next generation of the public sector in these crucial agencies. And we're trying to learn, it's a hackneyed phrase, all these phrases I learned as a management professor, I hear myself saying them, but I believe them now. It's kind of amazing. we want to be a learning organization. We want to, I say, a speech I gave last week, I said, we have to learn to fail. Fail is a good thing, because we learn from it. I said that. But I believe that we're trying to do that. We have enormous experimentation going on in our agency. I view it as part of my responsibility to diffuse the models that are working, to figure out what is kind of a quirky aspect of doing enforcement in one part of the country that won't transfer, and figuring out what we really can learn and expand more generally in other cases. And we're thinking hard about how we measure success and getting away from the idea of things like discounting numbers of investigations or number of violations or total back wage collected, and get ultimately to measures that reflect the mission of a fair day's pay for a hard day's work. How do we really move the dial to the extent we can, and in conjunction with the larger group of people who are concerned about the workplace, how can we work with them so that we really ultimately have a success? And that's what I think about every day is what am I doing, what are the key members of my staff and ultimately the agency doing to change and ultimately push forward the mission. I am learning by the moment, and I certainly don't have the answers. The good news is I don't need to have the answers. I have so much to draw from the experience of the people in the agency. But to come full circle with my sub-theme, I really would ask all of you to think about these issues. There's enormous talent and a group of people in LIRA who I have such deep respect for in terms of both your sense of purpose, but also the fact that you're tough-minded academics and think hard about problems. And I really want to draw on that kind of knowledge as we take the game to the next level in our agency, and I think the Secretary would say the same about the larger set of things we're trying to do at the Labor Department, not only on the worker protection side, but also on the worker training side. We need new ideas. We are at a moment, the country cares about these issues, the President deeply cares about these issues. There are incredible activities going on among the worker advocacy community in raising these issues to the public, and the public cares about these issues. So it is a very fruitful time for all of us to think about these things and to use our particular skills as academics to ultimately further the mission of my agency, and more generally the mission that I think everyone shares of making the workplace a better place for people. So let me tie it up there. Thank you.
So we have time for just a few questions. So Greg, I see you. If I can ask people if they can line up at the mics, and I'll go back and forth. Greg, you are the fastest runner to the mic.
No. I don't think it's on. Maybe there's like a...
Thank you very much, David, for your fascinating insights from the Washington bubble. And in your capacity as being in an important role in the learning organisation that you've touched on, I wonder if you have yet found any opportunities for learning from international parallels to the kind of role that you're doing. For example, any mistakes to avoid that you might have seen in other jurisdictions, or anything that could be a positive learning experience. My name's Greg Lambert. I'm at Monash University in Australia. And he's now got the microphone working. I hope you can hear the question.
Did people hear the question?
Yeah. Thank you.
So Greg, I'm doing international in my 5th week. I haven't No, I think there is an enormous amount of experimentation out there that we can and should learn from. And I've been certainly informed by it from participating in ILO activities, certainly in spending time in your home country and seeing some of the innovations that are going on. For instance, in the area of franchising in Australia, there's some really interesting experiments. There have been some terrific studies that have been coming out in the last few years on supply chain approaches in a variety of places around the world, the use of monitoring as a way of really, to quote Rick Locke's work on this, complementing national systems of workplace regulation. So I think, I mean, it certainly informs a lot of how I've started to think about it. I think we can learn a lot more. I think you've just identified one of the areas that I'm putting on the table, is learning from our friends in other countries who are, you know, what I'm struck by as I've talked about the fissured workplace is how it resonates with people in other countries. I had a 2-hour interview a couple months ago with one of the large financial journals in Israel, and I was shocked to hear about the guy read something I had written and was taken by his application to Israel. You know, and so I think I've heard a lot about the impact of franchising in Korea and its sort of comparable impact. So both the phenomenon is something I think many countries are grappling with, and there are experiments going on, and I think we have a lot to learn from them. So,
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Arlene Kim. I'm from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I appreciate your being proactive in finding violations, and I'm just thinking that if you could, God forbid, work across agencies, that would be even more powerful. So let me give you a couple examples.
Sure.
The state of Vermont allows for anonymous complaints. People can send employee manuals, and there'll be something in it that violates the law, and then they will, the Attorney General will go after the firm from that. They will proactively ask for any violation, let's say it's a minimum wage or maximum hour violation. They'll ask, is there a problem with women being underpaid? And usually people say, yeah, of course. And then they file a discrimination complaint in wages,
Right.
and again, proactively investigate. But that would be crossing agencies, but they'd be more powerful by doing that.
Right.
Another example is in agriculture. If you are a farmer, my grandfather was a farmer, and you have these people inspect the fruit every week to see if the fruit's the right size, if there's blemishes, if there's cuts on it.
Right.
And a lot of fruit goes to waste because of the cuts and everything. You can't sell those. If that inspector, but there's very little inspections of the agricultural workers because of the limitations on the inspectors. But if those inspectors go to the farms and all they have to do, the fruit inspectors, is look in the fields, they'll see children working there. So again, if you can empower them to also do the same kind of violations, there's a lot more fruit inspectors than labor
Right.
inspectors.
No, thank you. I am in total agreement with the insight. Let me tell you about some things we are doing, and let me tell you also where I think we could do much more in the spirit of your comment. Beginning in about 2010, Wage and Hour started to sign memorandums of understanding with state regulatory bodies in the area of misclassification. I won't go riffing in misclassification, but for those of you who don't know, misclassification is basically, or at least one of its most predominant forms, is taking someone who is in all respects an employee and calling him or her an independent contractor, and therefore basically blithely stepping over all the employment responsibilities that you have with that. And it's a huge problem across the country and across different industries. We've signed, I think, 15 different memorandums of understanding with state regulators who are also struggling with this problem. And how can we sharing information and experience on tackling that. We've signed a memorandum of understanding with a little agency called the Internal Revenue Service in terms of thinking how we can work together because of the tax losses arising from this classification. So I think that's an example, and it's hard. I won't kid you, and there's a lot of states that have done joint task force on misclassification with an understanding of exactly what you described, that it's not just one agency's problem, it's an unemployment insurance problem, it's a worker comp problem, it's a labor standards problem. And people are, I think, grappling with how do you do that more effectively, because it is more difficult. I've had an ongoing discussion, and I know our agencies have, with David Michaels, who's the head of OSHA. Because if you look at OSHA's kind of violation problems and our violation problems, surprise, surprise, they look a lot the same. And we are great in agreement that we could do better by leveraging the regulatory activities and our efforts in both agencies in a more coordinated fashion. So those kinds of discussions are certainly on board. You're talking about an even more expansive thing about sort of saying, you know, the USDA conducts thousands of investigations in meatpacking facilities. Well, we have huge problems in meatpacking in terms of labor standards violations and in OSHA. You know, thinking about how we cross that divide. And the final example you gave in terms of agriculture. Agriculture is a problem of deep concern to the Secretary, to me, to the Department of Labor. It's certainly something I'm thinking a lot about. How do we do that more effectively? And again, I think that's a combination of playing our game better. I mean, I think agriculture demands a very sophisticated approach that kind of marries the different pieces that I described before, just in terms of how we do it, but it also cries out for kind of a broader thought about how do we use the fact that there are a lot of people who are worried about food quality, you know, local food. I mean, I'm amazed at how the local food movement, until recently, has left out who's picking the crops, how are people being treated into these organically produced local foods. I love that, I believe in that. I own a farm share, a community share. But, you know, we got to marry those kinds of concerns. And that's a private set, that's a kind of a private oversight. But I think we can do a lot more in the area, and I am certainly thinking about the issues you're raising.
I'm afraid that keeping an eye on the time and knowing that we have sessions that start at 2 o'clock, I have to draw the questions to a close. But I do want to encourage those of you who have questions to come up and have a chance to talk with David as we break. And also to do a little bit of publicity. Tomorrow between 8 and 9:30, there is a session called Meet the Administrator Book Talk. David Weil, Enforcement in a Fissured Economy. So you have an opportunity of hearing David talk in some more detail about his most recent book. So I encourage you to think about that session to attend tomorrow morning. So again, I think a big round of applause to David.